first order of business is to find the right word, the right shorthand expression to characterize what happened in Gaza. The media in general has been characterizing those 22 days as a war. I don't think that's an accurate characterization. And in fact, I think it's a propagandistic one. But I'll let you judge for yourself. Use your own thinking faculties and your own knowledge of English usage after I present the basic and uncontroversial facts about what happened in Gaza. Many of them come from the Israeli government or its spokespersons. The basic facts are these. Israel flew 3,000 combat missions over Gaza. All the planes returned, none were downed, none of the planes were even damaged, for the simple reason that the Palestinian resistance had no anti-aircraft defenses to speak of. Several days after the air assault on Gaza began, Israel then launched a ground offensive. An Israeli strategic analyst writing after the events in Gaza, he said, and now I'm quoting him, "It is very dangerous for the Israeli army to believe it won the war when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during the 22 days of fighting. This is not a war. It is not even a real battle." One Israeli soldier testifying after those 22 days, he said, "It was like hunting season had begun. Over 100 Palestinians were killed for every Israeli that was killed." When you add up the descriptive facts and the numerical facts, no battles, no clashes, planes flying in, no anti-aircraft defenses, none of the planes downed, none of the planes damaged. All in all, 5 soldiers killed due to enemy fire, a ratio of over 100 to 1, 313 children killed, 83% civilians. It doesn't seem to rise, if we want to use that expression, it doesn't seem to rise to a war. If you were to look at a dictionary definition of war, at bare minimum, it would be 2 sides firing at each other. Well, what happened in Gaza doesn't rise to that. I think by any reasonable dictionary definition, by any reasonable English usage, what happened in Gaza was a massacre. Israel officially justified the Gaza massacre as what it called self-defense against Hamas rocket attacks. But even a superficial examination tells you that's not really a credible explanation of what Israel did or why it did it. Because if Israel wanted to prevent those Hamas rocket attacks, it would not have broken the ceasefire with Hamas that triggered those attacks. And Israel had the option up until the very end of December to renew the ceasefire with Hamas, but chose not to. Israel has also had the option, both with Hamas and the Palestinians generally, to resolve the conflict diplomatically for nearly 30 years now. Israel has rejected that option. But the question is, why did Israel do it? Why did it launch this attack? Why did it inflict a massacre in Gaza? There were two reasons why Israel launched the massacre. The first, to restore what it calls its deterrence capacity. And the second reason, Israel wanted to beat back Palestinian moderation, Palestinian reasonableness, the Palestinian willingness to negotiate a settlement. Israel needed to find a defenseless target to annihilate. The main New York Times correspondent in Israel is a fellow named Ethan Bronner, and around a week into the massacre he said, Israel's larger concern was to reestablish Israeli deterrence because its enemies are less afraid of it than they once were or should be. And trying to preserve its deterrence capacity has always been a major focus of Israeli strategic doctrine. In fact, that's pretty much how we got here today. The Gaza and the West Bank, Israel came to occupy those areas during the June 1967 war. The Israelis have always feared that the Arab world might one day modernize and then pose a threat to its hegemony, its control over the region. And one of those Israelis who was very concerned was a divisional commander. He later became quite well known, Ariel Sharon. And Mr. Sharon said that we have to attack Egypt. Why? Because Israel is losing its deterrence capacity. Our main weapon, the fear of us. And that's what deterrence capacity is. It's preserving the Arab world's fear of Israel. And whenever they feel that this fear of Israel is diminishing, whenever they feel the natives are getting restless and too uppity, then they have to move in and cut them down to size. The Arabs, of course, only understanding the language of force. Every once in a while, you have to take out the big club and break their skull. In May 2000, after an 18-year-long guerrilla war, the Hezbollah, the Party of God, ejected Israel from South Lebanon. Israel suffered a humiliating defeat, one that was celebrated throughout the Arab world, and the leader of the Hezbollah, Sheikh Nasrallah, wouldn't cease to remind the Israelis in his periodic speeches. He kept saying, "We're no longer afraid of you." Well, Israel knew that its deterrence capacity was being challenged. The Arabs weren't afraid. And so, immediately after the end of its occupation of South Lebanon, it began planning a new war against the Hezbollah. In 2006, July 2006, now we're closer to the present. In July 2006, Israel found its pretext, went into Lebanon, unleashed the full fury of its air force, prepared a massive ground invasion, but alas, it suffered at the hands of the Hezbollah, the party of God. It suffered yet another ignominious defeat. The Israeli army was basically defeated by village militias stationed on the border with Israel. Well, a disaster for Israel. Its deterrence capacity has now diminished. Israel wants another crack at the Hezbollah. For Israel, we're down, but we're not yet out. However, they didn't yet have a military option against the Hezbollah. Israel then tried to recruit the United States for an attack on Iran. The United States, Bush and Cheney, gave a thumbs down, said to the Israelis, we're not going to attack Iran. Then some of the Israelis went around saying, if the United States doesn't go in with conventional weapons against Iran, we're, meaning the Israelis, are going to go in with unconventional weapons, nuclear weapons. The United States still said no. Well, Iran has gone its merry way. Israel was humiliated, and its deterrence capacity had dropped another notch. So now Israel needed to find a defenseless target to annihilate in order to restore the Arab world's fear of it. And that's where Gaza enters the picture. Gaza being Israel's favorite shooting gallery. Even there in Gaza, the feebly armed Islamic movement Hamas had defiantly resisted Israeli dictate, and in June 2008 even forced Israel to sign a ceasefire or agree to a ceasefire. So the goal was, we're going to attack Gaza to restore our deterrence capacity. I don't know how many of you know what white phosphorus is. I only recently began to read detailed studies. White phosphorus is usually used as what's called, the technical term is an obscurant. That just means when it makes contact with oxygen, it creates a smoke. So it's used to camouflage yourself from enemy troops. It obscures the view of the enemy. An obscurant. That's what it's usually used for. But it's also true that white phosphorus reaches a temperature of, if your imagination is capable of grasping it, 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. And it burns the skin, and it burns right through to the bone. Israel dropped the white phosphorus over Al-Quds Hospital. It dropped the white phosphorus over the UN Beit Lahia school, which contained 1,600 Palestinians seeking shelter from the massacre. it dropped the white phosphorus over the UN warehouse containing food and medicine, huge quantities for the people of Gaza. Was it using the white phosphorus as an obscurant? Human Rights Watch, one of the two leading human rights organizations in the world today, alongside Amnesty International, just released a study on what happened in Gaza. And they said it's not possible that Israel used the white phosphorus as an obscurant. Why? Number one, an Israeli company manufactures smoke shells. They could have just used their own smoke shells as an obscurant. Number two, if you want to use it as an obscurant to obscure the view of enemy troops, you fire it on the ground. They were firing it in the air above civilian sites. Number three, there were no Israeli troops anywhere near the sites where they dropped the white phosphorus. They dropped it over Al-Quds Hospital. They dropped it over Beit Lahia School containing 1,600 Gazans seeking refuge from the massacre. They dropped it over the UNRWA warehouse, which also contains 700 Gazans seeking refuge. They dropped it for one simple reason: to use it as an incendiary weapon, to burn the flesh of those who were in those civilian sites. They had all the GPS coordinates of the hospital, of the school, of the warehouse. In fact, the UN officials in the warehouse kept calling the Israelis all morning, telling them to stop the attack, but Israel persisted. Israel sent in its jet planes, its helicopter gunships, its tanks, and its armored personnel carriers. It sprayed entire civilian neighborhoods with white phosphorus. It then proceeded to slaughter and incinerate this defenseless population. Who can now claim that Israel is weak? The Gazans were educated. 1,500 degrees phosphorus incinerating your skin. It's an education. One person who was really thrilled, he could barely contain his euphoria, was the New York Times' chief diplomatic expert, Thomas Friedman. Friedman always likes to tell the world how they got it all wrong, we're all simpletons, we don't have his titanic mind, we don't understand the ways of the world the way Thomas Friedman does. So we all think the world is round, but Tommy knows it's flat, presumably like his head. And so Friedman wrote during the Gaza massacre, he said, we all got it wrong. We all got it wrong. Israel didn't lose the 2006 Lebanon war. Israel won the 2006 Lebanon war. How did it win? He said because it inflicted substantial property damage and collateral casualties on Lebanon at large. Thereby, it administered an education to Hezbollah.